Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Voices of Delphi podcast. My name is Sarah France.
And I'm Makayla Davis. And we are two women joined together by a mutual love for the mystical, the magical, and the metaphysical. This podcast is dedicated to conversations on bridging the esoteric with the mundane, reintegrating ancient wisdom for the modern day, and inspiring listeners worldwide to reawaken the oracle within. And as always, if you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe as this helps keep you getting more of what you love.
Beautiful. Yay. Welcome back, Michaela. So nice to see you.
Sarah, we're in Saturn hell.
We are.
For those of you who
We-
don't know yet, we're going to be talking about Saturn today. And both Sarah and I have Saturn directly on our sun right now. So we
Yes,
couldn't
ma'am.
be better equipped to talk about this today.
Yes, this conversation is not just going to be a theoretical one. This is going to come from firsthand experience
Yeah.
of what it feels like to have the great master of time and testing right on the core of who you are, baby. So we kind of spoiled our riddle for today, but I guess we'll still share it anyways for those of you who are new to us. Obviously, the name of this podcast is inspired by the Oracle of Delphi, who is known for her prolific and poetic and oftentimes confusing riddle like responses that she would give to people's questions. And so, in tradition, we have started creating a riddle for each and every episode. So let me go ahead and share with you guys today, just as something to enjoy, despite the fact that you could probably already guess the answer.
My bad.
All good. So, our riddle for today is the following: I strip away that which was never really yours. I break what was built on someone else's blueprint, and I hand you back to yourself. I am not punishment, I am precision. Who am I? Dun da da da. I am Saturn. That is the title for today's episode. All things Saturn. Who was he mythologically? Who is he astrologically? And how he shows up in our lives through transit and cycles, in particular, the infamous Saturn return. So,
Mm.
with that being said, do you want to
Mm.
just jump right in, Michaela, and we can maybe talk about some of the general correspondences of Saturn and some of his manifestations in mythology, evolutionary astrology, traditional astrology? Sound good?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so I guess to get everyone warmed up here, Saturn is this planet and this archetype that comes through your life very slowly, right? It's a slow moving planet. So these transits that you get or these experiences that you get with this planet tend to take time.
Hmm.
And some people lack the patience needed to deal with Saturn transits, which is totally okay. Not all of us are, wired to have that fortitude that Saturn will have or strong Capricorn placements will have. But when Saturn comes around, you are really getting tested on your strength and fortitude to endure something in your life. And, this can probably feel a little heavy because it is like it's a heavy weighted type of energy that comes through. But the important thing to remember here is this is not a punishment. It is simply an archetype, a planetary energy that is coming to show you where your personal limitations are and how you can mature, evolve, elevate yourself into a level of authority, especially inner authority, so that you can handle these hardships. And, I am post my first Saturn return. You are exactly inside of your Saturn return right now. Am I correct?
I am actually the Saturn and Taurus generation, so I have yet to
Oh,
have my Saturn return.
okay. So this
I'm
should
gonna
be
have, I'm gonna be a late bloomer.
this is gonna be juicy. Okay. So Yeah, so I'm post Saturn return, so I've been through the first experience. And for people who don't know, Saturn moves in 30-year cycles, and then it also moves in 7-year cycles. And we'll kind of
Mhm.
break that down as we go along this. And it's really good for, astrologers to prep their clients for Saturn return energy or even Saturn transits in general, because you can
Mhm.
time important things in your life, like things that you know are going to take longer to happen, but they're going to have this staying power, if you will. If you do things correctly with Saturn, they do stay and they do build this foundation for you. But if you can't deal with the hardship and maybe you lack authority or initiative, Saturn's going to help you along. You just might not progress. And I've seen this with people. You just might not progress as much as you would have wanted. And that's okay. There's no right or wrong. But if you're aware of this energy coming into your chart, and you're willing to go into the depth of what Saturn wants to bring, then you can really create some momentum in your life. It's just going to take a bit of a time.
Yeah.
And I'll land my plane for a minute so you can jump in, but when I was going through my Saturn return, it was before I knew astrology.
Interesting.
Yes. So astrology actually came in the middle of the Saturn return. And Saturn can be a teacher. It can be symbolize wisdom, elder wisdom, if you will. And Saturn for me is in my third house in Porphyry, so it was all about learning something that was going to give me this lifelong wisdom that I had no idea I was going to turn into a career. But we can also associate Saturn energy with career and achievement and so forth, right? So these themes, it's really interesting how they play out when you come through your Saturn return. But for me particularly, it was this stripping down and this shedding down of myself, of my work, myself, who I thought I was, and really on a deeper level, how I was putting my self reliance outside of myself.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
So I went through, that was when I had my dark night of the soul. That is when I got engaged and then my engagement ended. These are themes that we'll probably talk about what happens. Um, and what I had to learn was to parent myself
Mhm.
and also know that I had this strength and willpower within me, this ability to go through something really, really hard and know that it was up to me at the end of the day, right? To give myself that parentalness that I was lacking early on, like in my younger years, right? And so I think the first Saturn, like Saturn comes in cycles, but it's always building from an evolutionary astrology lens. The very core theme that I like people to just take from this conversation, just leading an open conversation, is that the evolutionary journey here from our lens is to build this strong inner authority. And you will be met with challenges and resistance and limitations from people outside of yourself, society, structures, laws, regulations. We'll get into all that. You'll be met with those challenges. It is like a given. But really what you're getting out of this is mining something for yourself that is a really unwavering, unflinching inner authority at the end of these transits.
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to say, well done. That was a great summary of everything that Saturn can be. And I think that, especially when it comes to this idea of Saturn being the tester of foundations, that's a big one, right? And it's really, it's interesting to think about it in conjunction with our energetic system and our, energetic anatomy in the chakral system, right? Saturn is very much, I associate with the root, right? And
Yes.
one of my favorite things that I've heard about identifying possible causes for imbalances in that energy center is living in fantasy, which is an interesting thing to think about in conjunction with Saturn as the planet of reality, right? When
Mhm.
we are going through major Saturn activations in our lives, or conversely, if you have a very strong Saturn archetype in your chart, right? Saturn on the ascendant, moon, sun, or just a lot of Capricorn or even Aquarius from a traditional perspective, these tend to be people who are very consciously geared toward considering what are the facts, what is reality, right? They don't allow themselves to entertain fantastical ideas, right? Because it strips them of their inner integrity and therefore it strips them from their inner authority. And I think that a lot of what is wrapped up in these larger archetypal journeys that we go through under Saturn activations is that question of, am I living in alignment with my integrity? And if I am not, how is that stripping me from my inner authority and my foundation and stability in life? Right. Um, but it's interesting. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking, Makayla, is for those of you who have ever taken a course with me, you know, I'm a freak for etymology. I love it. I think that so much information can be gleaned just from looking at the root of a word and its etymology. And for Saturn, it's kind of this like nebulous background for the Greek word, which is Cronos. We don't really know exactly where it came from, but at least for the Roman word Saturn, it's likely to have derived from the Latin satu, which means sowing. Right. So Saturn is really this principle of you reap what you sow. Right. And we
Mhm.
see that in the mythology of Saturn. For those of you who are unfamiliar with his story, Saturn was essentially one of the many children of Gaia, Mother Earth, and Uranus, the sky god, right? And Saturn was, it's kind of funny because we see this, right, in people who personify Saturn very strongly, that he was known to be somewhat aloof, melancholic. He had a kind of dark sense of humor. He was cynical. He liked to spend a lot of time alone in contemplation, often to be found in a cave, right? He didn't
Mhm.
really want to participate in the family structure or in social activity in the way that his siblings did. But because of this kind of dark and brooding and unemotional nature that he had, when his mother felt that she could no longer stomach this relationship with his father, because Uranos was said to be quite abusive as a partner, essentially, I'll put it that way. Gaia went to Saturn or Cronos and asked for him to castrate his father, right? So that essentially he could stop raping her, was the, you know, there's no way to kind of get around that myth. So Saturn does this, right? And overthrows his own father and then becomes ruler of the gods. And essentially, he becomes privy to this prophecy that the same thing is going to happen to him, that his son will eventually one day kill him and take rulership over the godly realm. And in trying to protect himself from his own fate, he starts swallowing his own children, right? And his wife or his mistress, however you want to call her, the mother of his children, essentially played a trick on him during the birth of Jupiter or Zeus. And she wrapped a rock, she swaddled a rock in cloth and gave it to Saturn for him to swallow, and then ended up passing off Jupiter or Zeus to, I believe, some nymphs on an island far away in order to raise him. And lo and behold, Jupiter rises up to be the next king of the gods and kills his own father. And so, inherent in the story of Saturn is very much this energy of you reap what you sow, right? You are going to have to pay for the karma that you have created. And, you know, when we go through these Saturn transits in life, oftentimes we are coming into direct contact with the reality of that which we have created through small and large actions, right? And so when it comes to being on the right side of history or the right side of karma, I think the measurement that we always need to be returning to is, are we living out of integrity, right? Are we living in alignment with reality and integrity and honesty? Because if you are living out of alignment with those things and living in that fantasy realm, oftentimes those Saturn transits will end up being far more painful than if you had uh, done the former.
Hmm. I absolutely agree with you. And the mythology story, it is such a flow. The whole story itself is such a flow of actually how I see us humans experience this up until the age of 30.
Yeah.
And then we do it again, but with a different level of maturity. And so it's like we'll break like 0 to 7 is the Saturn cycle, 7 to like 14, right? Then 14 to 21, then 21 to like 28, 30, and you reach your first cycle. And you're talking in the beginning about, the fantasy, right? The fantasy, and then Saturn kind of bops you.
Hmm.
Saturn's like, bop,
Hits you with the reality stick.
bop. That's cool, but like, can we make this a reality, right?
Hmm.
Because we can't be in this ethereal, unpractical, imaginative place all the time. Because hey, you need to clothe yourself, you need to feed yourself, you need to have shelter, you need to think about how you're going to live and survive, and the work you're going to do, how you're
Hmm.
going to get there. What are your responsibilities to take care of yourself, right? So, for when 0 to 7, we are just playful children.
Hmm.
We rely on our parents, which is why Saturn also will represent to a lot of our upbringing issues, which will play a part in the karma that we're
Hmm.
integrating our life in, which is also a part of that root chakra. What are you born into? What are the family systems, the consensus of the nation that you're born into? What are the rules and the regulations? All of that, it's so big, right? But all of that leaves that imprint on your root chakra and your life as a child going from 0 to 7. So once you get that 7 year mark, children are usually met with that fantasy reality situation when that
Hmm.
Saturn first bop comes in, you know. So that might be your parents were together and now they're getting a divorce,
Hmm.
right? For me, for instance, I had a house fire.
Wow. At
Complete.
7?
Hmm.
Oh my
Yeah,
goodness. Okay.
right. So, and I specifically remember being on the bus, like it's clear as day. Wish I knew astrology then at like 4. I wish I came out of the womb knowing astrology.
Right?
It's just like, well, I'm an Aries, like, like,
Yeah.
but I specifically remember being on this bus and my neighbor coming onto the bus and they were like, "Where's Makayla?" And I like didn't recognize my neighbor because I was also like 7. And he's bringing me off the bus and I walking down the street and there's the fire trucks and then it was like
Wow.
reality had hit me at that moment. It was like
Hmm.
I was still 7, but I saw life real differently from that moment.
You're so right. You're so right. I think it'll be interesting for, listeners to think back to around that period of time, right? Age 7, 6.5 to 7.5,
Yeah.
and think about, yeah, you're right. It really does represent this transition, right? From that fantasy world of imagination and play to oftentimes we do become aware of some of these more adult concepts that are happening around us. I think for me personally, at age 7. For those of you who are unfamiliar with me or unfamiliar with my story, I grew up in a very kind of broken home with a lot of addiction and alcoholism. And at age 7, it was the first time that I became aware of the fact that my parents were addicts. Like before that, I
Hmm.
didn't really understand that that was, a component of my life and my, home environment. And
Hmm.
at age 7, it just kind of clicked like, oh, there's a problem here. My parents are different from other parents, right? And it did create this divide, right? Because no longer was I just able to go about life carefree. I always had that worry, right? And that's another thing about Saturn. It's that fear and that worry that can come online as well. So I think you make a great point. And Just an aside to that, I also think that when looking at your natal chart, it's important to look at the degree that Saturn is at. I don't necessarily subscribe to degree theory in and of itself, but I do find in practice that the degree that your planets are at oftentimes represent an age at
Yes.
which something significant around the narrative of that planet happened. So, looking at the degree that your Saturn is at and thinking about potentially some of those Saturn stories that could have come up at that time.
Yeah. Spot on. Yep.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Yes. And then, we lead with your mythology that you so eloquently said, by the way. So
Oh,
you're a
thank you.
master at that. I love it. Um, we progress. So then, what's Kronos' story next, right? He's now a rebellious teenager.
Hmm.
So wants to um, rebel against his father. At least, right, Jupiter, or no, yeah, we're having this rebellious nature that comes in, right? So that is the moment where, as we're growing up and maturing, we understand, oh, I have to go to school at this time, or I can't go out this late,
Hmm.
or, mom and dad or whoever's bringing us up says yes or no. And everyone has their own story when they're getting up to about 14 years old. But here you're really meeting this opposition. It's called the Saturn opposition for those who don't know. You're really the furthest away from your natal Saturn point. So you either are getting super oppressed by authority or restriction or limitation, or it's completely the opposite. And you're having to learn how to now embody that at a very young age.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting too to think about it in terms of the mythology and then the corresponding astrological archetypes, right? Is this opposition between Saturn and Uranus, right? And just generally speaking, Uranus at his most pure is going to be the liberated self, right?
Mhm.
The unchained self expression or the unchained liberty, right? Liberty is really a great key word for Uranus. Um, and Saturn is, of course, the limitations that we have to live by, right? Whether we choose them for ourselves or not. And I think we can get into this in a little bit, but so much of what I think is a smart way to approach Saturn in general and also Saturn transits is by learning how to self-limit, learning how to create rules and regulations that are actually helpful for you, that give you structure and that give you stability, right? Because the nature of this material world is one of limitation, and Saturn teaches us that. But back to the Uranus-Saturn opposition mythologically and how, that's the age 14, it really is this kind of dichotomy between the structure and authority and rules of the parental figures or the authority figures in your life versus that very Uranian need to liberate, right? And I feel like that is kind of the hallmark of adolescence, especially early adolescence, is that first, a lot of parents describe feeling like the child that they knew just kind of went flying out the window.
Yeah.
They don't
Yeah.
even recognize them. I remember
Yes.
my mom used to tell me, she'd be like, "You're like an alien. I don't even know who you are." Very good Uranian word, right? And
Yeah.
it's that Saturn opposition that really it calls your own moral and ethical compass into question against somebody else's and authority figures. Do you know what I mean? What are the rules and regulations by which I want to live versus those that are being imposed upon me? Is kind of the nature of that Saturn opposition.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for many people, it is appropriate for you to throw off your authority of oppression coming out from outside of yourself, especially if you were born with Saturn retrograde. That is within your nature to actually go against the grain of what everybody in your environment is showing you, right? Or if your Saturn moves retrograde by progression, I will see people switch and they're like all of a sudden they maybe they had a corporate job, loved corporate, Loved it. They were like the chief, the CEO, the top, and then like their Saturn will progress retrograde, and they're like, ain't for me. I got to go
Yep.
work from home. I got to be
Yeah.
living out of my van, and I don't know,
Right. They're
So
like, I want to be a monk.
right, just completely.
I
Yeah,
want
but
to be an
that might
ascetic.
even be too much structure too, So
Right.
it's like,
Yeah, true.
um, you know, but it's at that point, at that halfway point, we're so young still. We're like still not mature enough to like completely understand what is going on. But a lot of people do have to grow up pretty fast, and like you had to grow up pretty fast. So you're really getting into this phase, and then we go into the next phase where now we're reaching our second Saturn square,
Hmm.
which will bring that conflict and that tension. But we're kind of becoming a little bit more of an adult, but not quite. But we think we are for sure at 21 ish. And a lot of people they meet a partner, they meet like a very significant other. They move out, they live on their own, they travel on their own, they go to school, graduate from school if they started early, and a lot of people enter the job world professionally and start to take on a bit more responsibility in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those examples that you just listed of that third Saturn square tend to be the most common manifestations of it. And also, I think this is going to differ depending on your context, but I think a lot of this third Saturn square is about really refining, as those third quarter squares often are. It's a moment of crisis that calls for revision and refinement, which is a great keyword for Saturn, right? Saturn is, of course, exalted or happiest in the sign of Libra, the sign of refinement and balance, right? So this third quarter Saturn square, it's funny to think about how it brings in that relationship component as well sometimes. But more often than not, it's about coming to the realization that a lot of the structure of your life, your schedule, your, I guess you could say, like, for example, at least for many people, your job up until about 21, 22 is to be a student. And then, boom, all of a sudden that identity goes thrown out the window because you graduate, and now the entire world is your oyster. You're expected to be an adult, and you have to refine and create this whole network of structure for yourself. And, I can only speak for myself and for the people in my life, but I think we do the younger generation a huge disservice by telling them that post college graduation is going to be like the happiest and most joyous time of their life, because it was one of the fucking hardest for me because of that pressure from Saturn, right? From that
Mm.
Saturn square to really create a structure from nothing oftentimes. And I find that it can be a really isolating period. I've heard that from a lot of my friends and clients, that that third quarter Saturn square is an extremely isolating time for that reason.
Oh yeah, I mean that's around the time that I had joined the military,
Mm,
and
yeah.
I was in boot camp, right?
Yep.
So it's like that authority, that oppression, that structure that I thought I wanted. But I do, just from personal experience, I want to say that for people who are maybe around this age right now, that's good if you're working towards something and there's something that you want to achieve. Yes, go for that. But I can almost guarantee you it is not going to last when you go into your next cycle, when that end of your first Saturn return hits. You know, can we just lead with that like into the
Yeah.
because usually as this karmic, as you've seen with your clients too, there are so many things ending at this point, and it's okay. They serve their purpose, they were a structure for some reason. I tend to believe that everything that we've done up until our first Saturn return point, we've actually done in a past life. And for some reason, we've needed to reintegrate some of these lessons. Whether it's it's gonna come into the next 30-year cycle or not, that's a personal thing, right? For every personal chart. But some of those things maybe needed to close out karma or close out cycles. But a lot of people go through these life transitions now at the end of this 28, 29, 30, where they're either getting married, getting divorced, having children, buying homes, buying houses, or
Mhm.
figuring out where they're going to stay forever, or changing careers. It's like I think we're doing a good job painting this picture that this is a archetype that represents a heavier, weightier, more mature, important theme in your
Yeah.
life.
Absolutely. It's dense. I mean,
Yeah.
for those of you who are unfamiliar with this concept, planetary archetypes have correspondence with anything and everything from in existence, right? From an event to a type of person or profession to flowers, plants, metals. And Saturn is associated with lead, right? It's the
Mm.
densest, heaviest of all of the planetary archetypes. And for example, in like the Greek interpretation of cosmology, right? It was thought that when a soul entered into the physical world, the first planetary sphere that they would pass through would be that of Saturn, right? To pass through this extremely dense and heavy planetary energy to bring you into materialization, right? And when we're going through these Saturn transits, they really do feel like that. I mean, think about it. It's like these long-term heavy commitments, whether it's to a person, a geographic location, a job, there's a weight to them, a binding quality to them. And one of the things that I keep thinking about in terms of this idea of Saturn being tied to the material world and to density and to structure is even quite literally when we look at it from a biological and scientific perspective, every single 7 years, all of the cells in our body have completely replaced themselves, right? So it's on this 7 year cycle that we structurally are made into an entirely different being, right? And
Yes.
I've always just found that very interesting to think about. And I think it's a beautiful example of the way that the principle of Saturn, the archetype and energy of Saturn is deeply, deeply connected to the structure that we create for ourselves and our lives, right? It really does tend to bring up themes around, like you said, career, property, or like geographic location, and those really close, intimate connections or commitments, whether it's contractual or otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. So like when you're having body changes, you're not going crazy,
Yeah,
like,
really.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, like, look at even, I personally, I feel like I went through a second puberty at around like 21, 22. I don't know about you. You went through your Saturn return. I haven't gone through that yet, but maybe, you also felt that way during that transit. What?
Yeah, I lost a ton of weight during
Yeah.
that time, and I went from maybe like 130 down to way too skinny, like 110 almost.
Wow.
And I'm only 5'3" for everybody who's like thinking out there. And in a part of that oppression that was happening was because I was going through this difficult time in my life where my job was changing, the structure I was changing, my engagement had ended. And so I'm not putting fear into people because that is a Saturn word, but it can be hard. And because I was going through such hard stuff, there was this restriction on my body, and it also was coming through nourishment.
Mm.
So my body wasn't really getting nourished either because I did not have an appetite, right? So there's this kind of coldness that comes with Saturn at times. I felt like I was almost in a prison of my
Mhm.
own depression
Yeah, that's so good.
and was trying to figure out why. And it was astrology that became the way out for me.
Wow.
So it was this weird dynamic. And so I think certain people can relate when they're going through, even the squares can bring these up, The squares can bring these up. Not, I don't think it's as intense because it's more intense when you're getting the return because it's that infusion, that conjunction that's happening, natal Saturn to transiting Saturn. However, I can, and I believe you can attest, actually, when you get a Saturn transit to your sun, right? For instance, like we're handling it flawlessly because we have these tools And we know and we have this awareness. However,
I love you. We're
we're
handling it flawlessly.
honestly, but it is heavier. And for Aries sun, for instance, that has so much vitality and strength and excitement and can get amped up, to have this wicked opposite energy on top of your sun placement, just trying to be like, yeah, how much vitality do you really have?
Oh yeah, that is
You
what it
know?
feels like.
And it's like, it's that pressure, but also diamonds are created under that pressure, right?
Exactly. It's like creating a nuclear star. But two things that what you were saying was making me think of is first, when it comes to, yeah, the energetic quality of these Saturn transits, or even if you just, know that you have a strong Saturn in your chart. So again, Saturn is aspecting the sun, moon, the rising, ascendant ruler. You got a lot of Saturn ruled planets in your chart. That quality of Saturn, it's known to be cold and dry, right? This is why, for example, one of the more ancient techniques in astrology is called sect, right? Where we divide two planetary teams based off of their affinity for either daytime or nighttime, either being diurnal or nocturnal. And Saturn is thought to be strengthened, right, during the day and gets associated with the diurnal team simply because the light and heat of the day counteracts some of that dark and cold energy of Saturn and mitigates some of that melancholy and depression and I guess you could say lack that is associated with this archetype. And so when you're going through Saturn transits, they do kind of feel like a wet blanket. They really do, especially if you're somebody who has a lot of fire in their chart, right? Like we do. I think that Saturn is an energy that we can oftentimes resent a little bit. Fire does not really like
Or
that
air,
Saturnian energy or air. Yeah.
right?
And I think that, you know, Saturn does have this quality of it's kind of like a black hole, it really does strip things away and it takes you down to the skeleton. Anything that was not entirely necessary gets taken away from you in order for you to be able to see what is necessary and what was just frills. Right. And it's interesting to think about how in medical astrology, for example, Saturn is associated with the skeletal system, right? It's really all about structure. Um,
Mhm.
and it's something that I think is important to recognize because when you're under this energy, it can feel so oppressive at times. But I do think that the best way to approach these Saturn transits is through surrender. And I find that interesting because again, one of these more ancient techniques is known as the planetary joys, where each planet is said to have an affinity with one of the houses. And Saturn has an affinity with the 12th house, which is, among many things, really the place of learning surrender, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think with Saturn transits, what can be difficult about them is wanting to cling to these things, right? And so I think, at least personally speaking, I'm very grateful that I've come to astrology well before my Saturn return, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
I feel prepared with some of this awareness.
Mhm.
But I think that for any of you who are listening who are about to approach your Saturn return or any Saturn transit for that matter, really leading with, an awareness of, okay, how can I hold myself accountable, right? How can I live in alignment with integrity? And how can I allow myself to surrender, right? And I find it really interesting as well that you mentioned that feeling of being imprisoned by your own melancholy or by your own mental state, because whenever I teach on the planets, I love to incorporate the tarot as another added layer of nuance and information. And historically speaking, the tarot card, at least in the major arcana that's been associated with Saturn, is the devil, right? And I find that to be quite an interesting card because if you're not familiar with the imagery of this card, maybe we can edit it into the show afterwards so
Yeah.
people can see it. But you have this man and this woman who are chained to a pillar and they have these chains around their neck. And then there's, the image of the devil kind of perched on top of this pillar, leering over top of them. And the thing that people always point out about it, though, is that despite the fact that they're chained, these chains are quite loose enough to where they could just slip them off, and yet they choose not to. And so, inherent in that and its correspondence with Saturn is this feeling of really truly when you go through these Saturn transits, you feel chained to something. You feel like you can't give it up. You don't see any way that you could possibly live without this thing. And yet, when you're on the other side of them, and whether Saturn has forcibly taken it away from you or you have proactively surrendered to it, you look back and you always do realize, yeah, I didn't need that. I could live without that. And I'm actually better for not carrying this with me anymore.
This is so beautiful because that is extremely accurate and on brand and on point, especially for being in the aftermath of it and with the hindsight and the maturity that you get from this precious planet. It sounds so difficult the way we
Mhm.
describe it,
I
and it
know.
and it's good because we don't sugarcoat it for people. And some people have it really hard. They do
Hmm.
because that's a part of your soul's journey,
Yeah.
right? And is to, step into your authority. One of the things that I love that you're talking about was the medical side of that, right? Because it is the skeleton, which is that inner structure that is going to support you, which is obviously about all the things that we've been speaking of, that you're going to carry throughout the course of your life. But it also rules the skin. It rules
Yes.
the outer of the body, the skin. And inherently, from the evolutionary astrology lens, Capricorn and the Saturn archetype, we blend together in many ways, and it is inherently emotional. And I find that not enough people recognize that this archetype is an emotional archetype. It represents a parental sphere, if you will, your ability to nurture and care for yourself. And that has to come with boundaries, boundary making in your life. And it's not to throw boundaries out there like, well, I'm setting a boundary because I'm uncomfortable. It's more of a maturity that you have grown into understanding in order to caretake for my inner self, which incorporates the opposite of Saturn and the opposite of the Saturn archetype is this Cancer. So this ability, this Cancer, this emotional side of us, inside of us, the place where we need belonging and nurture and care. The opposite side of this Saturn actually has this, it provides this container, this safety container
Mhm.
for our inner emotional world to exist in. And so, we're so free and we're so careless when we're young. We're 7, we love everything. We love everything. I love my teddy bear. I love whatever. I love every animal. I still love every animal. That doesn't change. But 14, even 21, we fall in love, for instance, right? So easily. Because I don't think we have actually matured enough to create a container, a boundary, a structure, an authority of what we really need and what we really need to have wisdom to protect ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. It makes me think of I was listening to a book on Ayurveda a few days ago. And one of my like passion subjects to research is medical astrology, astrological herbalism, Ayurveda. I'm obsessed with it. And in the opening chapter of this book, this practitioner is talking about how the study of Ayurveda, right? And Ayurveda in Sanskrit literally means the study of life, or in some contexts, they do interpret it as the study of longevity, right? And that at its core, Ayurveda is about establishing balance in the body, right? And how do you do this? Well, this author, this practitioner asserts that you do this through self limitation, through learning how to proactively consciously limit yourself by, again, this Cancer Capricorn axis, developing an intimate and embodied experiencing of your physical vessel to be so receptive to that intrinsic information that comes to you through being grounded and rooted in your body, that very Cancerian kind of wisdom, and to use that information and that signaling that your body gives you to then do the Capricornian or Saturnian thing. And again, have the integrity and the discipline to self limit and to establish balance in the body, right? And I've always found it so interesting that I love to talk about how Saturn is exalted in the sign of Libra because people always do. Oh, they do Libra such a disservice by talking about it in such a superficial way, right? Libra is always painted in this very Venusian light, and yet Libra is inherently this combination of Venus and Saturn, right? Truly. All Libras out there, I know you know what I'm talking about when I say there is a more somber, more contemplative, and deeper, more stoic quality to Libra than we are ever given credit for.
Mhm.
For those of
Yep.
you who don't know, Miss Makayla is a Libra rising. I am a Libra moon. So
Yep.
I feel passionately about this topic. And, it really is this interplay of, you know, you have to be able to moderate and temper Venus in order to, live in balance, right? Venus, hedonism, right? Lust, desire, Saturn, restriction, limitation, boundary, right? And that through the interplay of learning how to synergize these two energies effectively, you come to a state of homeostasis energetically, emotionally, physically. So that's just kind of a random tangent. And I have another little random tangent that I wanted to share
Yeah, go.
about Saturn energy and Saturn transits in general, which is that, uh, you know, as a personal trainer and a bodybuilder, the only way to actually prevent the breakdown of your skeletal system is by putting your skeletal system under immense amount of pressure through weight training. For
Hmm.
you ladies out there who are
Hmm.
listening, who are maybe fearful of getting in the gym and lifting heavy, don't be, because one of the leading causes of things like osteoporosis in women is not actually putting the skeletal system under enough pressure, right? And I find that so interesting. When I first learned that, I was like, that's so Saturnian, right? That the only way to strengthen Saturn is to put it under pressure and to put it under immense weight. And I find that these Saturn transits and just Saturn stories in general, they feel pressurized in that way, but you really do come out of them on the other side so fortified.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you're building muscle, when you're doing weight training, heavy weight training, you're shrinking your physique actually because your muscles are more dense than fat. Fat is expanding. So people who have more fat on their body or higher body fat content, they're just larger. They're thicker looking. And so I want to reiterate, women, do not be afraid because I am a heavy bodybuilder. If you just look at my Instagram page, you will see. Um, I stepped on stage and I was dense. I was dense, but I was strong. And there comes a level of confidence with this, right? So, whether you're putting your body, your physical body under pressure, or you're putting your mental or emotional body under pressure, when you reach the outcome, when you eventually get there, and it takes time and effort and energy with the Saturn placements, with everything we're talking about, you do reach this crystallization. That's the word I was looking for earlier with Saturn, because this is something we talk about with EA is anything Saturn related becomes crystallized inside of your emotional, physical, or mental body, and that becomes the authority of your life. When you want to use Saturn for positive attributes in your life, you put that positive energy towards where you want to build, where you want to grow, what mountain you want to climb on, you get a level of confidence. And it's not cocky confidence, hopefully. It's like, I did this hard work. Let me show you how it was done. Let me teach you. Let me give you the wisdom. Let me be a symbol. And this is why, Capricorn is at the top of the astrology chart and it rules the midheaven, the 10th house. Let me show you what you can achieve too after I've done that, right? Um, But when you're in that, when you're in these transits or this energy, you don't necessarily always see that because it can seem like the finish line is so far away,
Mhm.
you know? So it's like I want to tell people my advice is just don't try to look at that long stretch at that point. Sometimes it's way too far out. You don't know how quickly you can collapse time. You don't know how quickly you're going to get there. You know, for instance, I built my dream body in 3 months, and that was something
Holy
that I wanted for years. But
damn,
then when
girl.
I finally laid the law down for
Yeah,
myself and stuck to it, right? There's that strictness that you need to, but it's always about what you want, right? It's always about what you want to bring into your life with that.
exactly. It's always got to be, again, connecting it back to that Venus component. It's always got to be in correlation with and conversation with your desire nature, right?
Yeah,
Coming to
yeah.
own what it is that you desire and then having the discipline and fortitude of mind and body to actually get yourself there, no matter how long it takes, no matter how much effort, no matter how many sleepless nights, right? It's that nose to the grindstone energy. And
Mhm.
it's funny, as you're talking about this, it's making me think, like I mentioned earlier, I'm the Saturn and Taurus generation, so I've yet to go through my own Saturn return, but my partner is currently going through his. It's like exact as of this week.
Mm.
And he's been constantly saying, like, we're in our lock in era, Sarah. We got to lock in. We got to lock in. We got to lock in. And I just kind of laughed to myself because I'm like, it's
You gotta
such,
lock in.
yeah, I'm like, I'm like, it's such Saturn energy, right? You know, coming to terms with the fact that like there are things that I desire out of life that I have not achieved because I have been loose. I have not held my feet to the fire. I have not held myself accountable. I've not been honest. I have not structured my time appropriately. That's another great thing to talk about in correspondence with Saturn is this relationship with time, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, we use Saturn more often than we use the word Kronos, but Kronos is the root for all of these other words that we have, right? Chronological, chronometer, you can go on and on and on. Kronos was the god of time, right? And so much of what Saturn also brings up for us is our relationship with time, right? This reality that when coming into this physical plane, we exist in a world of limitation. That's just what it is. That's the nature of being in these physical bodies. We are not in our ethereal state, we're in a physical state.
Mhm.
And with that comes the reality that we do have a limited amount of time here
Mhm.
and we need to make the most of it. And that the best way to do that is, again, that synergy of Venus and Saturn, right? Get really clear on what it is that you truly desire and what you find joy in. And then have the dedication, commitment, and determination to actually hold yourself accountable to structuring your life around those things each and every day. And I find that under heavy Saturn transits, in one way or another, they oftentimes bring up these kind of hit yourself with the reality stick of, oh shit, there is time, right? Time is maybe not running out, but
Mhm.
Saturn can literally be a planet that, for example, when Saturn crossed over my moon, my father died, right?
Mhm.
So Saturn can bring up these moments of realizing like time is finite and time is limited. And where
Mhm.
that can be so challenging, it also is precious,
Mhm.
right? Because it gives you a distinct level of appreciation and respect. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the essence of like how you wrapped up is the result is
Hmm.
going to show exactly how much work you put in. And it's not a shame, guilt thing, feel bad thing. It's just a reality check and a checkpoint. When you do reach these points, it's like, well, I could have done this much more work, right?
Hmm.
And how do you feel looking back? Especially, I feel with people reaching their second Saturn return, and I hear most of my clients are in their 60s. They're approaching their 60s. And a lot of people coming into their second Saturn return are looking back now. And it's not as looking forward as the first one. It's looking back and I did this, this, and this. This is what I have up at this point. So they're looking back in time and asking themselves these questions of like, how do I want to spend, the rest of my life, my time, my
Hmm.
energy? Many of people hopefully have done enough work to set themselves up for something a little bit more cushy where they can make different choices now, right? But I mean, I think that's why it becomes hard too, again, with your second Saturn return, even to make hard choices. Because, for instance, if you have been married for almost 50 years, let's say, and you're getting into your second Saturn return, which happens with a lot of people, and they're like, what will people think if I break up my family at this point? you know
Hmm.
I've been with this person for so long, because with these themes, it is how we're seen by other people. Do they respect us? Oh, I thought, for instance, I thought you were the most amazing couple ever. I looked up to you guys. My grandparents are separating, right? It's like this symbolism again of what other people have also projected onto you, which can be the square from Libra. It might not resonate at certain points anymore. So, you're going to go through this process of this time, pressure, and effort, and being seen for the results that you put in. But then you're also going to come to these points under these Saturn transits where it just doesn't resonate with your authenticity anymore. And then one of the questions you can ask yourself with Saturn is, do I want to be responsible for this? Do I want this at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about, especially when it comes to Capricorn, right? Capricorn is, of course, a Saturn ruled Earth sign. And yet, Capricorn is also the sea goat, right? There's this watery component to Capricorn, which is such a rich and juicy nuance to Capricorn that people don't talk about enough. And the way that I've always thought about it is that there is, inherent in this journey of crystallizing and constructing, these materialized physical representations of who you are and what you are an authority in, comes this watery element of what you love and care about, right? And so oftentimes under these Saturn transits, and I find that Capricorn people, if you are a Capricorn person, Capricorn heavy person out there, um, comment, let us know if you relate to this. Both of my siblings, I'm the only one of us who has no Capricorn placements. They are both Capricorn stelliums. So I see this in them is this kind of crisis moment I find for a lot of Capricorn people and under these Saturn transits where you come to the realization that you have spent so much time, energy, and attention pouring into something, and then you've lost an emotional connection to it and you no longer can carry on, right? And so when people talk about Capricorn in this way, where they paint them to be completely unemotional, kind of aloof, hollow robots, only focused on money and material success, that is not true. Inherent in them and in their archetype is the need to have a profound emotional connection to something. And whether they deem that to be spiritual or not doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it is. And, I think that under these Saturn transits, there can be this kind of like come to Jesus moment where you realize, shit, I really don't care about it anymore. Or I don't care about it enough to do the grueling work to continue to build it. And now I have to surrender it.
Hmm. Absolutely. There was a
Hmm.
trend that was going on TikTok actually that was called the Capricorn switch.
Oh,
And people, I did a bit. I
okay.
was like, oh, I gotta get on this. And they were people. A lot of people were talking about how Capricorn will just, and they'll have that staying power. They will be loyal, and Saturn has that staying power and loyalty about it, until it doesn't deem it sensical,
Hmm.
practical, useful anymore. So it's so spot on. It's so true. If the emotional connection is not there, and it's interesting because as somebody, maybe you're in the life of somebody who's highly Saturnian or highly Capricorn, you might not see it because these placements tend to withhold their emotions, and because there's a stoicism about this archetype. And they feel this level of responsibility to just be the most mature one in the group or in the family or in the work environment. And so you very much won't necessarily see, and there's this reservation even around this archetype, which you won't necessarily see happening, what's happening beneath the surface, because they're so good at that holding, that staying power. But again, that could be going on within your own internal experience too, depending on how connected you are to your own emotions. If you're somebody who kind of is still working through that emotional connection within yourself, that Cancer side of you, you might not realize that this erosion is happening, and that's why life gets hard.
Hmm.
That's why these transits can be so hard, because you're not listening to the erosion and the switch that Saturn is coming in to ask to
Yeah,
be made.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Saturn is, for example, one of the, mythological images that is associated with him is the sickle, right? And the
Mhm.
sickle is an agricultural tool, and we see this, come all the way from Babylon, right? We had the god Ninurta, who was basically synonymous with the later Saturn or Cronos, right? And he was an agricultural god, right? Farmers would speak to and pray to Ninurta, right? So there is this kind of earthly, agricultural, architectural component to Saturn. And also, you know, the sickle is the tool that is carried by the Grim Reaper, right? So there is a sense of grief that is inherent in
Yeah.
Saturn, right? Especially if you're somebody who has like a moon Saturn kind of placement in their chart. You know grief very well. Personally, I have moon opposite Saturn in my chart. So, there is this there is this demand from Saturn and Saturn transits that makes you come to terms with the fact that grief is an inherent part of life. Nobody goes through life without having to grieve something, right? Whether it's someone or something that you've built, right? A relationship, a job, a home, a family, you know, under these Saturn alignments, you will have to come to terms with the fact that part of life is just managing grief,
Yeah.
right? And learning how to channel it effectively and redirect yourself. And when it comes to, the best advice that I can give to anybody who is dealing with Saturn natally or by transit is, learning how to have a healthy relationship with grief and not using the fear of grief as an excuse to put off or kick the can down the line some of these changes that must happen. And intuitively they have to happen. And yet you're so fearful of the sadness and grief that will come from that, because it's only preventing the inevitable, right? Rip the band-aid off, so to speak.
Yeah.
And also, I think accountability is a skill, right? It really is a skill. And it's a skill that I think this is another topic, but I think in today's day and age, it's a skill that we're kind of giving people the out on developing. I think accountability is something that a lot
Hmm.
of us are not taught how to do effectively. And the other side, right? The other side of the coin to accountability is shame, I think, right? I think a lot of people, instead of viewing moments of whether it's, somebody sitting across the table and giving you constructive criticism on, a job that you did, or whether it's the proverbial kind of cosmos and ether, right? Kind of presenting this opportunity to take accountability and take account, right, of your life circumstance and the things that you've been doing and the ways that you've behaving. You can either take that as an opportunity to criticize and shame yourself, or you can take that as an opportunity to hold yourself accountable, right? And own the fact that you're imperfect, but have compassion for yourself and the knowing that everybody is imperfect, everybody makes mistakes, and that, information is it's a way to protect yourself from future mistakes and future failure, right? So I think that developing that accountability muscle is really, really important when going through Saturn transits.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you 100% on that, and especially related to the shame part,
Hmm.
which is definitely rooted so deeply in our society. with for religion, politics. I see a lot of people shaming other people for whatever political side of the spectrum that they're landing on. And in reality, it's so much more vast than are you leaning left or right, for instance, right? Red or blue. It's so much more, it's about your little choices, which is why we bring in the trines from the other earth signs, from Virgo and from Taurus. It's really your little choices, your discernment, your daily actions that are rooted in the Taurus side, the value system that you have. Listen to episode 2. And how is that supportive? Is that supportive for you? And then it's easier to process taking accountability if you know that you're operating and you're making choices and discernment based on your values. Yeah, you're going to mess up. You're not going to be 100% perfect. And to understand that everything that you're making decision or choice or building on is only based on the information that you have at that point, that time. So it's like, don't be so hard or critical on yourself with Saturn transits or Saturn dynamics if you didn't have all the knowledge or the full picture, the full spectrum. And I think it's really interesting that you bring that part of the journey up because when you look at the entire wheel of the zodiac, you begin all the way from Aries to Sagittarius, which is right before we hit Capricorn, all the way up into that. It is really a solo journey,
Hmm.
and it's a journey of yourself learning, discovering, connecting, communicating, playing, loving, sexing, like all these. You go through this lovely journey of life and all these experiences, and you gain all this wisdom. You reach Sagittarius. Now you're embodying this wisdom through that experience, and that lived life itself becomes this intelligence within you that's operating and breathing. And then you reach this Capricorn, and it either stays or it doesn't. It either crystallizes and becomes something in you, or you get bopped by other people, life, society, right? And that is really depending on how much work you've done prior to that whole journey within yourself will really depend on how much inner authority you're giving yourself at this point. And I guarantee people who are listening to this podcast have a good inner authority established already because they're looking at astrology and looking at esoteric knowledge, and it's just you're on a different caliber. You're on a different caliber. And then if you can handle that part of life that is necessary to reach, confront our shame, confront our guilt. It's inherently wired within us because it's suppressed within you from everything else in life. So it's normal. You get to actually liberate yourself, which is when we come into Aquarius, which is probably a conversation for a different podcast. But modern astrologers will also associate Aquarius with Saturn, the Saturn archetype, because it is the same essentially, but it is completely different because this is when we liberate, break free from ourselves and decide to take our authority and go towards a path that is more authentic, which is that Aquarius side. And I love to look at the last two signs of the zodiac, this Aquarius and Pisces archetypes here, just kind of separate than the rest of the entire zodiac wheel because they operate in this interpersonal and then outer personal dimension, where you're really kind of breaking off before you start this whole new cycle again.
Yeah, I think you're totally right when talking about Pisces and Aquarius in terms of being these transpersonal
Mm.
signs. And I do think of Capricorn in that way as well. Capricorn is the architect of society, right?
Mhm,
I very
mhm,
much envision that Capricorn archetype as the builder, the architect, right? Like for example, my brother, bless him, Capricorn rising, Capricorn stellium. His favorite game is Age of Empires. He loves to play that game where he can just build empires all day. And like Catan, if anybody out there has played Catan, I actually really like Catan. It's fun, but side note, um, but it's like that, that interest in the mechanisms of society at large, the
yeah.
architecture of society through government and through buildings and through city planning and urban planning and all of these things. I do think that these last three signs are very transpersonal in that way.
Mhm.
But looking at, Saturn through the lens of the two traditional signs that are associated with Saturn, Capricorn and Aquarius. I find that I always like to circle back to the very basics, right? Like Capricorn as an earth sign is the feminine expression of Saturn, and Aquarius as an air sign is the masculine expression of Saturn. And with Capricorn, you know, feminine signs, they're all about reception and transmutation, right? So I find that Capricorn is really this introduction into Saturn where we are on the receiving end, right, of limitation and boundaries and restriction and pressure and weight. All of my Capricorn heavy people out there know that they are typically born into family structures where they're the one who everybody turns to, right? I always
Mm-hmm.
think of Atlas. They have the weight of the world on their shoulders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're on the receiving end of that Saturn energy, and they have to learn how to carry it and transmute it and transform it. And then we get into Aquarius, and we have this intellectual air sign that is the proactive creation of Saturn. And one of the ways that I love to describe Aquarius is about how, you know, Aquarius is a sign about how the intellect, right, or the mind of the collective becomes crystallized, right? By, basically the way that we are able to move the public and intellectually stimulate the public in order to solidify thought or ideas or beliefs into legislation, into social structure, into culture and society. And there's that very kind of active creation of Saturn in there, right? That active crystallization of the hive mind, right? And we
Mm-hmm.
see that in Aquarius's connection to like the cultural zeitgeist and trends, right? We see it in fashion and music, in the arts, right? Is that like that materialization of where the collective mind is at any given point in history. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And like personally, if you're, I mean, we did have this big Saturn Jupiter conjunction in Aquarius. I think that was the end of 2020, which was a massive shift for all of us in our lives to kind of break out of, which obviously it came right after COVID. Like, come on, you cannot make astrology up even better, right? Where we had to have this reckoning in our life of responsibility and routine and ritual and authority, and what are we going to do with that in our lives. And we had this big conjunction happen in Aquarius, which was about the liberation here, right? And one of the things for people to remember with, if we're looking at the Aquarian side of Saturn, is it is going to be rebellious. It is going to be innovative, and you are going to feel like you're on the outskirts of society or you don't fit in for a while. But it is within that moment where you begin to carve your own path, take responsibility in your own way, in your own unique, authentic approach, that you begin to actually carve the path and the leadership for other people to follow. Is eventually you'll get your tribe with the Aquarian side of Saturn coming in, right? You might feel isolated at first, which are these Aquarian traits. You might feel, yeah, ostracized or just alienated from other people at one point. But when you have that staying power at this point, you do begin to find like minded hive people, like minded trends, groups, or networks to associate with, countries to associate with, laws to associate with, right? Whatever it is. And then that begins the restructuring process of your own internal world, but then also on the external world too. But it
Yeah.
does have to have a collective shift or a collective movement, and I think enough people willing to not be suppressed anymore by these Capricornian themes and willing to take the risk and the chance to break free and break apart on the Aquarian side.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you read my mind. I had a point about Saturn transits and Saturn energy, and you gave me the perfect segue. Um, because I was going to talk about how, again, for anybody who has a very strong Saturn archetype in their chart, especially Sun Saturn, Moon Saturn, or if you're going through any one of these transits right now,
Mhm.
uh, Isolation and loneliness is
Mm-hmm.
a huge component of Saturn. And Saturn oftentimes creates this illusion of you being more isolated than you actually are. Or there can be some real life circumstances that objectively do create a moment of isolation or loneliness. And yet, under the energy of Saturn, we can perpetuate it, right?
Yeah.
I speak from personal example as somebody who has a moon opposite Saturn. I have deep love for so many people in my life, and I oftentimes find that if I'm not conscious of it, I can go months without reaching out to these people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's that nature of Saturn. He was notorious for going into a cave, right? And being the kind of hermit that he wanted to be and having no contact with the outside world and with any of the other gods. And I think, especially when you're going through Saturn transits, it's important to remember to do the Aquarian thing and
Mm-hmm.
to still connect with your community, right? And to
Mm-hmm.
find people who can truly understand you and
Mm-hmm.
hold you through that space and uplift you, because the only thing that will make it worse is perpetuating those cycles of isolation that Saturn
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes create.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's that risk. There's that risk involved with um, taking a leap of faith on the strength that you have to make your own choices, which is a Saturn thing.
Mm-hmm.
Can I be responsible for myself, and what does that look like, and what does that mean? And people catch up. That's the Aquarian side. Some people I think are inherently wired with more Aquarius in their chart. I have a lot of Aquarius in my chart, and I have always been ahead of other people, my family, friends, and they catch up every time. Every time. It may take a couple years, but then they're like, "Oh, I see what you saw." I'm like, "Oh, well, join the club." I'm like, I'm already
Literally.
somewhere else. I'm already somewhere else.
Literally.
But there is that loneliness for a little bit, but then people catch up, and then they're like, "Oh, I see things," and it's just to create that emotional experience for people to kind of feel into. It's okay, right? All of this is okay. It's just like part of the entire journey when you're getting these kind of transits coming into your life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an important reminder because Saturn is, after all, the proverbial critic. Saturn
Yeah.
in mythology was extremely cynical and critical, and we see that in very Saturnian people, right? And when
Yeah.
Saturn is influencing our charts and our lives, we can fall into this loop of extreme criticism and pessimism, right? And I
Yeah.
think that again, just another tool to take into some of these transits that can be helpful is to zoom out, right? Do the Aquarian thing, take that bird's eye view, right? Allow yourself to just entertain the thought activity of viewing your life through the lens of the third person
Yes.
perspective, right?
Yes.
And giving yourself the ability to look at these cycles and seasons for what they are when you zoom out that far rather than
Yeah.
hyper fixating on what you are lacking and what is not going your way and what you can criticize and judge and demand of yourself. I think can again be another helpful tool because at the heart of this is really getting back to that Saturn in the 12th house affinity,
Yes.
surrender, right? Transcendence, and also the 12th house is really the place of spiritual and emotional healing, right? And
Yeah.
compassion.
Yep.
Oftentimes it's through facing, the 12th house is also the house of self-sabotage, right? So it's
Yeah.
through facing our self-sabotaging tendencies and coming to terms with them that inevitably we will find compassion for ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think if you are going through these transits, if you are somebody who has a strong Saturn, every time somebody comes to my practice and I see a very strong Saturn in their chart, compassion is like a huge topic of conversation that
Yeah.
I have with them because it can be hard to have compassion for yourself and your journey when you're
Yeah.
under that influence. Um, but it can be so, so helpful.
Absolutely. I agree. So, with all of this emotional and intellectual talk about what Saturn means or what it can feel like, Sarah and I kind of were ruminating on practical journaling, ritual techniques, like things you can actually do in your practical life, um, to physically connect with Saturn energy and kind of help you move through these hard times or heavy times or overly responsible times, like what have you. So, a couple of things we were talking about was journaling prompts, having specific journaling prompts for reflection, which Saturn will applaud you for. Like, I don't think Saturn's going to bop you for not reflecting back on your choices and where your responsibility lies. And so, something that you might want to write down and kind of take some time, carve out some time for yourself to free write and kind of meditate on is what structures in my life were built for survival versus soul, right? And what am I being asked to release here? And also, what am I being asked to claim? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And, as somebody who one of the, I guess you could say, most difficult planets in my chart is Saturn, right?
Mm.
And I've had to really lock in on working with Saturn energy. And some of the habits or practices that I've gotten into are one, replacing, like we were just kind of talking about, criticism with compassion,
Mm-hmm.
right? So noticing when those critical ruminations, right, come up and actively forcing myself to replace that messaging with a message of compassion,
Mm-hmm.
right? But along with that, you are required with Saturn to do your due diligence and still hold your feet to the fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, again, this practice of daily self limitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, it can be something as simple as you know that you need to get up early the next morning and you really need your 8 hours of sleep, but it feels so good to lay in bed and scroll on your phone for an extra 30 minutes. Limit yourself, stop yourself, see if you can even do it just
Mm-hmm.
for 5, 10, maybe 30 days, right? And it's fascinating to see how you know, when you self limit and you self contain consistently, even in these micro ways, over the course of time, it develops a trust and a faith in yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which gets back to that root chakra work where you can really have a confidence in the fact that you can trust yourself to do to do the dependable, to do the realistic and the practical thing, and that
Mm-hmm.
you have integrity, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
can live by your integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And another practice which is a little bit more niche, but I find that it's important with Saturn, is to focus on your relationship with time. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of people have a somewhat, I guess you could say, disordered relationship with time. Whether you are somebody who is chronically late, whether you are somebody who is riddled with anxiety about being late, and so you have to show up to a place 30 minutes beforehand and just sit in your car, right?
Mm-hmm.
About learning how to maneuver time in a way where you are not leading with fear and you are also not leading with disrespect or with
Mm-hmm.
aloofness, right? Because these are two things that I think Saturn does not respect, right? Looking at your relationship with time and examining that can actually be kind of this more backdoor way of healing some of these other aspects of your relationship with Saturn, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I guess I would just add on that is being mindful of the commitments that you're making.
Yeah.
And so if you're somebody who's struggling with those kind of things, it's the deeper layer is what are you committing to that you can't commit to, and just be realistic with that. Are you overcommitting or undercommitting to yourself? For instance, like just thinking back at my own personal journey with the fitness competition, for instance, I had a timeline. I committed to myself and to my coaches and to my team. And if I wasn't ready to realize that that was the time I commit to, then I wouldn't have achieved my goals. And then that would have hindered my confidence and my trust in myself. And so, yeah, on the deeper level of ritual or healthy practice with Saturn, meditating on this, journaling, really evaluate that. Right? Is this the right time? And it's okay if it's not the right time for something. It might be down the road. But when you're dealing with Saturn themes, you're dealing with longer things in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the last things I'll mention is practicing radical honesty and radical
Mm-hmm.
accountability with yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that that is something that Saturn really honors and respects and values.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you are in a relationship and you know that you are being mistreated or that you do not genuinely enjoy this person and yet you are staying with them out of convenience, pity, dependence, whatever it might be honest with yourself. Hold
Mm-hmm.
yourself accountable. If you are staying in a job that makes you miserable because you're telling yourself stories about how you have to make a certain amount of money a month and there's no other way to do it,
Mm-hmm.
hold yourself accountable. Be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of these ways that we get stuck, again, coming back all the way full circle to Saturn's relationship with the devil in the
Mm-hmm.
tarot. Be mindful of the chains that you put around your own neck that you can free yourself from.
Yep. 100%.
Cool. All right.
I think that's a beautiful way to wrap it
All
up.
right.
So,
All right, everybody. So, with
yeah.
that being said, thank you so much for joining us this week. We appreciate you all. Again, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe. Makayla and I are so grateful to have you here and excited to continue to bring this wisdom and content to your For You page. So, Makayla, thank you so much. This was a
Thanks,
beautiful
Sarah.
episode.
Thank you, Sarah.
All
Bye,
right.
everybody.
Bye, guys.